All right, we're going to take you straight to Capitol Hill now, where House lawmakers are voting on the Build Back Better Act. The vote continues right now, but as you can see, the yeas are ahead, as is to be expected. This is a delayed vote. The plan had been to have this vote yesterday, but House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy went on an epic speech, if you will, record-breaking speech on the House floor, talking about this bill as well as a host of other things, and ultimately to make a point and also to delay the inevitable, which is the vote. The expectation is, of course, Vlad, that it'll pass in the House, but there are still challenges as it moves on to the Senate. The price tag is still of concern. Whether or not it will be fully paid for is of concern, but let us listen in. All right, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe now at the White House. Ed, a partisan response, as one would expect, on the House of the floor there. The Democrats literally jumping up and down and clapping. Where do things stand right now?
Chanting Nancy, 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 it sounded like there, and Build Back Better as it passed the 218 vote threshold a few minutes ago on its way to final passage. Things now go to the Senate, where it's unclear exactly how this bill might change. The Speaker has gone to great lengths this week to point out that what is passed today by the House, while certainly a big and at one time thought to be improbable step, it's now going to get a little reorganized over in the Senate, given the different way they do things over there. This bill essentially has to be broken up into at least two different pieces. There has to be discussion with the Senate parliamentarians, or the referees, if you will, over whether everything in this bill can be voted on using the so-called reconciliation process, which allows for just a simple majority vote. Everything in it has to be deemed relevant to budgetary matters. Very procedural. But the question will also be, can this get done before Christmas and send back to the House for final passage, or is this going to get punted further into next year as moderate Democrats continue to raise concerns about the scope of this, whether it could have an effect on inflation, which of course remains a top concern not only to the wallets of Americans but to the politics of this city, and then whether or not they will have the 51 votes needed in the Senate to get it through, and then to have the House pass any big changes. But as you said, this was supposed to happen last night around 8:30 Eastern, which is about as late as you want to hold a big vote in the House, because it's at least still dinner time out west. But House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy took advantage of what's called his magic minute, which allows him, the Speaker, and the Majority Leader to speak for however long they'd like to by activating the magic minute rules. And it essentially gives them the power to do what senators can do and filibuster for as long as they'd like. He did it for at least 8 hours and 37 or 32 minutes. Either way, he broke the record. 8 hours and 32 minutes, breaking a record set just a few years ago by Pelosi herself, who had spoken for 8 hours and just a few extra minutes. So he surpassed her in that regard. And usually when this happens, it's the minority party trying to stick it to the majority party and rain on their parade, which is what he essentially did overnight, spending all the hours overnight talking about essentially, it was a Festivus, if you will. He was airing grievances by Republicans about what Democrats have been up to over the course of this year, and sort of trying to set the table for what could happen if you believe current polling and Republicans taking over the House next year. But either way, a very big victory here. Mostly symbolic at this point because the conversation, the debate over this bill has to continue, and we're nowhere near total completion. But given how tricky the negotiations have been over this for the last 10 months, it is a big moment, and one that, again, speaks to the skill of House Speaker Pelosi as she wrangles a 221-member caucus that has been so bitterly divided over these issues of spending and infrastructure really this entire year.
All right, and let's bring in Nicole Killian from Capitol Hill. Nicole, we were just talking earlier about the potential for this bill getting passed today. Looks like it's happening right now on the floor of the House.
Absolutely, and to Ed's point, yeah, really, Democrats were hoping this would happen last night, but look, you know, they moved quickly this morning. They only allowed about 5 minutes of debate so that they could avoid a repeat of what happened last night when you saw Leader McCarthy taking the floor. But look, this is a huge moment for Democrats. This has been months in the making. It's taken about 10 months to get to this point, and it has been very ugly at times. As they say here in Washington, you know, nobody likes to see how the sausage is being made. And there were many times when it looked like this bill would not get to this point, even as early as about 2 weeks ago, you know, when Democrats were trying to vote not only on this Build Back Better package, but also the infrastructure package. They were once again here late into the night on a Friday behind closed doors. Nobody knew what was going on until there was kind of this breakthrough agreement to just vote on infrastructure, and then they set up the rule for this Build Back Better package. So, you know, this has come through a lot of different iterations, a lot of different hurdles. But again, at this point, the Democrats are very hopeful that they can again keep this train moving when it goes to the Senate, even though you have folks like Senator Manchin who have expressed some objections. You know, Leader Schumer telling me he's confident. He hopes they can get this done by Christmas. But, you know, as Ed also pointed out, this will have to go through probably some additional changes that may not be as palatable to House Democrats. But I think even if that ends up being the case, you know, I don't think House Democrats really want to upset the apple cart at this point. So, you know, once this clears the Senate, if it clears the Senate, it'll go back to the House, and then hopefully Democrats can wrap this up. They would like to wrap this up in a nice bow before Christmas if they can.
So let me ask you, Ed, you know, the score from the Office of Management and Budget came out. We were talking about that earlier with Nikole about how that, you know, this bill is expected to sort of add to the deficit. What's happening at the White House? I'm sure, you know, they are working to smooth things over in the Senate so that they can get this through.
Yeah, the Congressional Budget Office was the one that coughed up the estimates yesterday.
Thank you.
Essentially a day ahead of schedule because they had originally said that they wouldn't come until today, but they got their work done early, which allowed the House to get moving on this last night. There have been competing estimates, really. This one, the congressional bean counters did theirs. The Treasury Department behind us did their own as well. And both of them essentially said, when all is said and done, it's not going to have and there were private forecasts done as well, perhaps more importantly for some of these members, that said there's not going to be a real effect on the ongoing concerns with inflation. Yes, it's adding to the deficit, but not necessarily to a massive extent or as big as some had feared. And that ultimately they can say that it will be paid for based on the estimated costs of all this and the revenue that would be generated otherwise. This is the kind of stuff that slowed it down. The other thing that slowed this debate down, I remember having conversations with you guys back in March saying, so this is going to be passed by the start of the August recess, right? And we said, yeah. Remember, it's going to be months. The rescue plan that was passed very early, very quickly this year in March was done quickly because they'd set an urgent deadline and they understood that Americans needed the money. But these other two bills, and the reason it's taken until now to get the infrastructure one signed this week and then this one passed in the House, is what Nikole was speaking to just a moment ago, that members of the House who will face competitive re-elections next year don't want to be passing something that then gets dramatically overwritten or rewritten and overhauled in the Senate, and then they have to come back and pass something entirely different, allowing whoever they run against next year, whether that's in a primary or the general election, to accuse those Democrats of having voted for something even though that may not have necessarily become law, or they voted for something that maybe constituents would have liked but then got stripped out of the bill. So part of the reason this has taken so long is that group of moderates and the progressives have said, we want to know, and we want to be on the same page as much as possible with our Senate colleagues, that ultimately what happens here is going to be the same when it gets sent back to us. And most of this bill will be. What we're fighting over at this point is things like whether or not there will be a paid leave provision in this thing or not, whether or not there will be about $100 million to pay for more immigration judges in this country to sort of meet the concerns of those that say that immigration reform has to be dealt with in some form this year, and this is the way to do it. And whether or not there'll be something like a big tax credit for people who buy electric vehicles. Joe Manchin, key moderate, a handful of others say we shouldn't be doing that because that would potentially suppress an automotive industry in this country that still hasn't entirely adapted to building electric vehicles, and it could put a lot of people out of work. Plus, incentivizing electric vehicles over ones that are backed by the oil industry because you need gas is something that some of these Democrats just aren't comfortable with. But most of this bill's ready to go. So watch the next few weeks as they have this conversation over scope, the final details, and remember that most of this legislation is already agreed to. It's just going to be a handful of details, plus a really tricky congressional calendar leading up to Christmas that includes having to pass the debt limit or figuring out when to do that, how to keep the lights on across the federal government and avoid another shutdown on December 3rd, and passing a massive big defense policy bill that may get a few other things tucked into it. We're getting to that point, as we do every year, guys, here in Washington, where the calendar and reality seem to not exactly see eye to eye, and it becomes crunch time.
What's interesting, Nikole, is Speaker Pelosi didn't hold back this morning when she was responding to some criticism of, or McCarthy's criticism of this bill. And we talked about this, Nikole, and also with Ed, that she's been fighting for this for months. So bring us up to speed as to exactly sort of what led to this moment, trying to get these Democrats, the Democratic caucus, aligned on this bill. There was that score that they were waiting for from the CBO, all these things that were sort of in the mix before we got to this point this morning.
Yeah, well, look, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to trust. And that really is a broader theme and issue here in this Congress, not just between Democrats and Republicans, but even within the Democratic Party, because moderates and progressives haven't necessarily been on the same page throughout this whole process. You'll recall initially it was progressives that were kind of holding up this measure because their big thing was all along they wanted to bring these two bills along at the same time. That was their understanding from leadership in terms of how the process should work, keeping these two bills linked. And at the end of the day, they just didn't want to lose any leverage they had by, moving forward with this bipartisan infrastructure bill when it was passed over the summer without any guarantees about this reconciliation package. Because to the point that Ed made, there are, especially here in the Senate, at the end of the day, you've got to have something that clears both chambers, but it's a little trickier in the Senate. And so, again, you have certain senators who have very specific requests and don't really want to spend, everything in the wallet right now on this package. And that's why we have seen this package come down in price over several months. Initially it was supposed to start at $6 trillion, then it went to $3.5 trillion. Then finally it came down to this, $1.75. So this has been the product of months of negotiations. But furthermore, progressives wanted to make sure that their key priorities were contained in this package, that they weren't gutted in pre-negotiation. So until they got that guarantee, they kind of held on to that infrastructure package and refused to vote on it. So there was a lot of gridlock for several weeks. You'll recall back in late September, there was a point where that infrastructure vote was supposed to happen, and it had to happen because there were some provisions that were expiring. Didn't happen because progressives were upset. They didn't feel that the negotiations were where they needed to be. And then again, we saw some resistance by them a couple of weeks later. But then, you know, finally when progressives got on board, then it was moderates who were balking, saying, you know, look, we need to make sure this is fiscally sound. And that's where, you know, you heard earlier this week and the weeks prior that, you know, moderates more specifically wanted to make sure they had that information from the Congressional Budget Office. And so that's why about 2 weeks ago, when they tried to do this all at once, it didn't work because they just weren't on the same page. And it literally took progressives and moderates coming out with these statements saying, you know, they agree in principle to the conditions of what happened for today's vote, which was that both sides committed to voting on this package this week. For moderates, their conditions were that they got that scoring information, which did come out this week. And in doing so, progressives said, well, we'll go ahead and support this infrastructure bill, even though we didn't before, and even though we wanted these packages to move together. So it's been a lot of, you know, moving the puzzle pieces throughout this whole process to get everyone on board. And again, you know, in the Senate, it just becomes trickier because you've got folks like Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, who are more conservative within the party. And so, again, they have specific concerns. And so that's why you're seeing this bill may have to be tweaked more so that it does pass their particular test, you know, because, again, Leader Schumer has no votes to spare on this. So it has been a very arduous process, but at least for now, Democrats in the House can take a victory lap because this is a huge win for them today and for the White House.
Ed, you know, just really quickly, you know, we talked about the infrastructure deal being compared to the New Deal. In that that's transformative. Obviously, this social spending package is also a really big deal, and if it passes in the Senate, that's huge. Still, you know, just the other day, Vlad and I were talking about the poor approval ratings that the president has, and you know, I'm sure that you and I are going to talk about how he's taken the show on the road sometime in the next few days, especially if this social spending portion passes. The messaging seems to be off because it's not being connected to him and the work that he's doing. And we know with these infrastructure, projects, one of the reasons why they usually have bipartisan support is because even Republicans can go home and say, look what I built you. And, you know, it helps to bolster their own popularity. So I'm wondering if you've heard from the White House at all about this sort of disconnect between what's getting done in Washington and how the general public feels about the president.
I mean, they are aware of it, and they pin a lot of it on general exhaustion over the pandemic, the fact that it's not done, the fact that inflation obviously has become a very big concern, and so when the economy's bad, people have a tendency to take it out on the party in power. And I think they also know, whether they will say this, and they have to some extent, that the wheels really came off for them in August when you had the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, something they knew that was going to be messy, as the president himself had said, but probably went messier than anticipated. And you remember you also had things in August like the Haitian migrant crisis suddenly pop up around the same time. And so there was this general, and negotiations over these two bills were going nowhere. So you had this general sense of, wait a second, this guy said he was the competent manager, and he can't seem to manage these things quite well right now. And on top of that, you had the Delta variant surge, and then inflation. So there's a lot of things that have happened. They look at these numbers and say, yes, they're bad, but we got a year to go. And once we get these 3 big pieces of legislation passed this year, we can spend much of 2022 going out and selling it, whether it's the president and the vice president themselves, whether it's members of the cabinet, whether it's lawmakers who help pass them. And this White House has committed itself to doing that. We'll see how ambitious a roadshow this becomes, because this is at least the 3rd time this year they said, we're going to go out and sell this in a big way, and they do like 3 or 4 events in the Northeast, and they never really do it again. So will this sustain itself into the new year? Will we see the president out there talking about these 2 bills? Should this Build Back Better get passed in the next few weeks? But they know they got an issue, and they got to deal with it. And it's something that I think they're just hoping that results, once they're all passed, can then be sold leading up to November. And they also believe that by the spring, the inflation issues should be peeling away, because the economy should be, and the supply-demand issues should be sort of stabilized and back to things where they used to be. this, by the way, this vote that's going on has nothing to do with what we are talking about here. So we want to switch that. We don't need to be watching this procedural motion on something completely unrelated, other than the fact that it's good television because there are some people doing things. But we're now at this point waiting to hear. We're waiting to hear from the Speaker and Democrats who will toot their own horns about this when this unrelated vote is completed. And we should also, if you guys don't mind, convey some information over the president's whereabouts right now and something a little unique that's underway, and that is that he's up at Walter Reed Medical Center for his annual physical. The White House has said much of this year that they would let us know when this was going to happen. It is happening this morning. The White House also tells us that the president's undergoing a routine colonoscopy, and because of that, he's going to be under anesthesia. And because of that, he is temporarily transferring power to Vice President Harris. They point out that this has happened before. In 2002 and in 2007, George W. Bush had similar procedures done under anesthesia. He temporarily transferred power to Dick Cheney, and then things went back to normal. This White House, keenly aware of how the former president handled his medical history and information about his health, however, is trying today at least to make us aware of things as they're happening. They have said that they will issue a written report of the medical exam later this afternoon from his doctors. We may also learn more about for how long was he under anesthesia and for how long was the vice president temporarily in charge. The White House says she's working out of her West Wing office here until the procedure is over. She is also scheduled to go today to Columbus, Ohio, to Anne-Marie, sell this legislation and make sure that Americans are aware of it. So there'll be some of the salesmanship today, but the vice president also essentially exercising her utmost constitutional power, and that is at least temporarily stepping in for the president as he undergoes what the White House insists and assures us is a routine medical exam and procedure.
That is pretty historic. I mean, I know it's for a short period of time, Ed and Anne-Marie and Nicole, but the fact that a woman, an American woman, is acting president, even for a brief moment as the president undergoes this colonoscopy, is historic. I mean, it's sort of a red letter date in American history.
Certainly for Vice President Harris, amid a week of bad press. Yes, by the end of it, she can say, well, I did what I'm here to do. And by all accounts, as long as it goes well, she will have done that. But yes, and so again, you know, watch the next few hours as they explain how it all went, because they're very eager to, you know, always contrast themselves with the last guy. And so as long as they present, you know, a pretty transparent and open explanation of how things went today, they will believe that they will have handled that a lot differently than former President Trump. Remember, they brought in his doctor once or twice. There was the moment after he was diagnosed with COVID-19 where the doctors had those unwieldy and somewhat disturbing press conferences where they were describing some elements of his medical history and not others. Here, they're a little more concerned about making sure everyone's aware of it all, and they're going to put it all in writing and let us know later today.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Vice President John Adams, who called the vice presidency, guys, the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. But it was done specifically for this moment. You wait around all day until the president's incapacitated, and that's your constitutional responsibility, Anne-Marie.
Yeah, indeed. Well, you know what? Someone's got to do it. It's not a bad gig at all. So I guess I think we've pretty much covered a lot of this. Ed and Nicole, thank you very much.
You bet.